Joy flooded across the nation, and everyone celebrated in one accord. Tough times and complete disaster had crashed down on the American people when the stock markets did, and then the second terrible World War had come. For 5 long, bitter years it had raged, tearing at the hearts and homes of so many around the country. It had crept away now, as quietly as it had come, leaving behind a gaping wound, a vacant chair at the table. A lone girl crept down steep basement stairs to where the church had held canteens for soldiers on leave, for those too far from home. Counting the familiar steps, Charity made her way through the impenetrable black. Her knee hit into something, and she vaguely remembered a chair being tossed aside in the mad scramble after the victory news. On quiet feet, she crossed to a well-loved piano at one end of the room and rested her hands on the worn keys. Something irresistible called her to sit once more on the bench and play again, this time for an audience who were far away, but could finally return to their beloved country. Warm light suddenly flooded onto the top few basement steps. It came from the church kitchen above, where a few women had stayed late into the night to clean. The young girl, sitting in the hazy gray darkness before her piano, could hear them quietly bustling about overhead, and felt a bit of comfort when someone began softly humming a hymn. Charity's finger slowly traced a name scratched into the piano's wood, and a chiseled face flashed before her eyes. She could picture Trent leaning against a brick building with his hands in his pockets, gazing off into nowhere, but he turned his head when she spoke. Mr. Trent? Yes. Who is Katie? She had whispered softly. My little sister back home. Why? He asked. The girl read a loneliness in his voice, not expressed in words, and an aching wish to help swelled up in her throat. Tears filled up her eyes and threatened to spill into her voice. You called me Katie back there. She smiled, though it wasn't without pain, and moved her hand to each name scratched into the piano finish. Stories, hopes, and fears flooding back to her with each one. As her fingertips felt the roughened place of a signature, she could see that person, a memory of them springing before her eyes, and with each, her energy was freely given to thinking of his story, and a prayer was sent toward heaven by the young girl who had crept into the abandoned church basement on that night of celebration. If no one else remembered the country's brave soldiers just then, they could be sure their piano girl with the full eyes did. Her shining brown eyes smiled as she remembered how precious the church's cherry wood upright had been to her, to the point where everyone thought of it as that little girl's piano, and how she had guarded the thing with fierce devotion. So many things were heaps more important to her now, and the hundreds of names scrawled into its front were priceless. Hey, you in here, Johnny? We're wanted back at base. Word just came we're shipping out in an hour. Johnny! The words rang in the girl's ear, making her startle and look around, half expecting to see the anxious man that had burst into that same basement months ago. Johnny drew a deep breath that shook slightly, and then he called, "Be there in a second." Young, dough-faced Johnny had tweaked her braid and said with a wry grin, "Thanks for everything. Keep playing songs to gladden our boys. I won't forget how you put happiness back into my heart." The next time she had seen that face, it was gray from pain and pale against the whiteness of the hospital bed. He hadn't forgotten. A truly cheerful grin flashed across his face at sight of her, and he had promptly said, "I suppose the nurse wouldn't let your piano tag along." The girl slipped her hand into her sweater pocket and closed it around a telegram. Johnny wouldn't ever smile in this world again. Thoughtfully, she began to pick out a few strains on the keyboard, then dropped her hand to her lap, something dampening her eyelashes and sticking in her throat. "Oh, God, please protect the boys. Bring them back safely." She breathed, and a torrent of tears came rushing to her. A breeze moved her strawberry hair, and Charity thought she heard a deep laugh as a navy cap flopped over her eyes. "A bit too big, I'd say," shouted one merry fellow slouching nearby. Giggling, she put her hand up to adjust it, and the scene vanished. Disappointment washed over the girl. Sitting alone in the still, quiet basement, she looked around at the bare room and wondered if this were the first time the dance floor had ever been empty in those 5 hard years. She didn't like the silence. It just wasn't right. Her hands slowly wandered over the ivory keys, echoing the melancholy in her throat as the chords rose and fell in volume. Suddenly, a thought brought a smile into the song, and the melody quickened. Closing her eyes, she remembered how it had been. Her fingers fairly pranced along the familiar keys, playing a favorite ditty the soldiers had requested over and over at one canteen. Laughter and singing floated up the basement steps and out to the sleeping street as a group of soldiers pushed open the door, stepping into the warmly lit room. A sight of merry chaos met their eyes. Soldiers turned boys again for the night, danced with girls in the middle of the room. Men on benches along the wall discussed their faraway homes, and others darted here and there laden with heaping trays of sandwiches and cookies. The church folk melted easily into the masses of servicemen, and the whole crowd was turned into one jolly bunch, braving the dull truth the night air told them. Peeking over the piano, her brown eyes could see the sea of faces before her. They were full with the things she had seen in her 12 years, full as her heart was. She caught sight of a young, haunted-looking boy in uniform hanging back along the walls, and pain washed over her face when she remembered another like him who had never come back. She longed to cheer him, to listen to his fears, and be the sister he had left at home. Ducking beneath the top of the piano, she had tried to concentrate on the jumble of notes that blurred before her eyes. Someone sat quietly beside her on the bench, and a strong hand caressed the cherry wood front. "This your piano, miss?" a manly voice had asked in a soft tone. She smiled up into a careworn face with a scar across one cheek. "Not exactly, sir, but I feel so," came the shy answer. There was a long, companionable silence in which the song came to an end, and the dancers dispersed to fall upon a table laden with food. Charity paused in her playing and stared into space. Her mind traveled back to a prayer meeting 3 years ago. She had only been 9 then, but the quick message beforehand had stayed with her and would produce itself in vivid memory during many hard times. "This war has ripped savagely at most everyone, but it cannot defeat us. No, evil never can wholly defeat God's people. It may get them down for a time, but God gives us strength for the next day, and the day after that, and the next, courage to fight back." Launching into onward Christian soldiers, she could almost hear the minister now, bellowing courage to the congregation. "Let each of us fight our best wherever God has placed us. Let us arrive in heaven all used up. Never give up. Never give in. Do not grow weary of giving yourself for others. For Christ." Like his words, Her music softened. Strains of "In the Sweet By and By" sprinkled among the flowery chords. The preacher had leaned forward, elbows on his pulpit, and an earnest, joyful spark in his eyes. "Then, when the good Lord calls you home, He will give you a whole new you." His voice dropped to a whisper that cracked with emotion. The church rustled as each member leaned eagerly forward to catch his next tenderly spoken words. "And He'll say, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You used yourself up for me, just like I did for you.'" A great feeling of peace washed over Charity, and she continued playing as though in a cozy, delicious, sweet dream. "He will say, 'Well done, good and faithful servant.'" The words lingered in her mind as the girl's head sank wearily to the piano, pillowed in her arms. Her lips moved slightly as the everlasting song inside her lulled the Patriot to sleep. "We shall sing on that beautiful shore the melodious songs of the blessed, and our spirits shall sorrow no more, not a sigh for the blessing of rest."